Deep inside a cave in modern-day Iraq, archaeologists found the skeleton of a man who should not have survived. His arm was withered and useless. He was likely blind in one eye. He couldn't hunt, couldn't defend himself, couldn't even fully care for his own body. And yet he lived for years like that, in a world with no hospitals, no medicine, and no safety net. Someone kept him alive. And that single discovery cracked open a much bigger question. In a prehistoric world this unforgiving, what actually happened to the most vulnerable people of all, children who suddenly lost their parents? The obvious guess is grim. Without adults to hunt, gather, and protect, a child's odds looked close to zero. That's the story we've told ourselves for a long time, shaped by decades of movies and pop culture that paint the Stone Age as a world ruled purely by survival of the fittest. But that skeleton in Shanidar Cave hints at something else entirely, and it's not the only clue. Archaeology and anthropology together tell a very different story, one built from bones, burial sites, and the behavior of hunter-gatherer societies that still exist today. And it suggests something almost nobody expects, that losing your parents 20,000 years ago may not have been the death sentence we assume it was. To understand why, we first need to understand just how hard childhood actually was back then. Hunter-gatherer life left no room for shortcuts. There was no farming, no stored grain, no livestock to fall back on. Every meal came from what could be hunted, fished, or foraged that day, which meant food supply shifted with the seasons, the weather, and sheer luck. A bad injury could turn fatal fast. An illness that we'd treat with a pharmacy visit today could kill within a week. Children bore the brunt of all of it. They couldn't hunt. They couldn't cover long distances. Every bit of food, shelter, and protection they got came from someone else. And human kids are uniquely expensive to raise this way. Compared to almost any other species on Earth, our children take years, not months, before they can meaningfully contribute to the group. That's a long window of total dependency. So the question becomes obvious. If the people responsible for keeping a child alive suddenly vanished, what happened to that child? For a long time, researchers assumed the answer was simple, and simply bleak. But evidence collected over the past several decades has started to complicate that picture significantly. Start with the myth itself, because it's worth breaking down. Prehistoric humans are usually shown on screen as ruthless and purely self-interested, people for whom compassion was a luxury nobody could afford. Archaeology doesn't back that up, and that skeleton from the opening is a perfect example. He's known to researchers as Shanidar I, a Neanderthal discovered in Shanidar Cave in modern-day Iraq. Researchers believe he had lost significant use of one arm and likely had impaired vision, injuries severe enough that independent survival should have been out of the question. And yet he lived for years afterward. That kind of survival doesn't happen alone. Someone had to help him get food. Someone had to help protect him. Someone had to step in on the days he simply couldn't manage on his own. Shanidar I isn't a one-off either. Archaeologists have found many prehistoric individuals whose injuries or illnesses should have made independent survival nearly impossible, yet they lived on regardless. That pattern points to something real. Cooperation and caregiving weren't rare exceptions in prehistoric life. They were part of how these communities functioned. And if groups were willing to carry an injured adult for years, it raises an obvious next question. Would they have done the same for an orphaned child? To answer that, researchers turn to anthropology, studying the small-scale societies that still live by hunting and gathering today. They're not frozen time capsules of the Stone Age, but they offer something valuable. A working model of how humans organize care when resources are tight and survival isn't guaranteed. One pattern shows up again and again across these societies. Children are almost never raised by two parents alone. Grandparents step in. Older siblings help out. Extended family pitches in, and often so do adults with no blood relation at all. Anthropologists call this cooperative breeding, and it makes humans strange among primates. Most primate infants rely almost entirely on their mother. Human children draw support from a much wider circle. That difference matters more than it might seem. If one caregiver gets sick, gets injured, or dies, the system doesn't collapse. Someone else absorbs the gap. In practice, a child's survival often depended less on two specific adults and more on the resilience of the whole group around them. Many researchers believe this strategy is ancient, older than agriculture, older than settled life itself. If that's true, it means plenty of Stone Age children may have had a safety net built into their community long before anyone wrote down the idea of an orphanage. Anthropology gives us the pattern. Archaeology gives us the proof. Some of the most telling evidence comes straight out of the ground, from burial sites scattered across Europe, Asia, and beyond. Stone Age graves containing children are often surprisingly elaborate. Some hold ornaments, others contain tools or objects that seem to have carried symbolic weight, the kind of grave goods usually reserved for someone the group considered important. Burials like that take real effort. Digging, decorating, and provisioning a grave costs time and resources that a starving, indifferent community simply wouldn't spend. So this tells us something worth sitting with. These children mattered. Their deaths were felt. Their absence was marked deliberately and carefully. That undercuts the old assumption that prehistoric people viewed children as disposable. The physical evidence points instead toward real emotional attachment, grief expressed in stone and bone and ornament. Burials can't tell us exactly how an orphaned child lived day to day, but they tell us plenty about how children were regarded, and that regard looks a lot like care. Here's where the story gets even more interesting, because helping orphaned children wasn't only an act of kindness, it may have doubled as smart survival math. Every surviving child was a future hunter, a future gatherer, a future parent, a future carrier of the group's accumulated knowledge. Communities that managed to raise more children into adulthood had a real edge in surviving across generations. Seen through that evolutionary lens, protecting a vulnerable child wasn't charity so much as investment. And that fits a much bigger pattern in human evolution. We're not the fastest species. We're not the strongest. We don't carry natural weapons like claws or fangs. What we had instead was cooperation, sharing food, sharing knowledge, sharing the burden of raising the next generation. That web of shared responsibility likely extended to orphaned children as a matter of course, not exception. None of this means every orphan made it. Life in the Stone Age didn't forgive mistakes easily. Food ran out, winters turned brutal, disease spread, predators attacked. Some children almost certainly died after losing their parents, and no amount of cooperation could have saved everyone. Archaeology doesn't paint a soft, idealized picture of prehistoric life. It paints something more honest, a world where hardship and cooperation existed side by side. What the evidence does suggest is that orphaned children weren't simply left to fend for themselves by default. Many likely had access to some form of community support, whether that meant adoption by relatives or collective care spread across several adults. The exact shape of that support probably varied by group, by region, by era. We don't have the fine details. But the broader pattern keeps showing up. Human communities went out of their way to protect their most vulnerable members. And that points to something bigger than childhood survival alone. It points to something fundamental about who we are. For a long time, the assumption was that compassion was a product of civilization, something that arrived along with cities and laws and organized religion. The evidence increasingly suggests the opposite. Long before cities, before kingdoms, before anyone wrote a single word down, humans were already cooperating, already sharing what little they had, already looking out for one another. That doesn't mean prehistoric life was gentle or free of conflict. Violence existed, competition existed, rivalries existed, but running alongside all of that was another force, just as real. People choosing to help each other survive. So, what actually happened to children who lost their parents in the Stone Age? We'll never know most of their individual stories. No names survived, no records were kept, no orphan left behind their own account of what those years were like. But archaeology, anthropology, and evolutionary science all point in the same direction. Many of these children were likely caught by their community rather than left to fall. Not because life was easy or resources were plentiful, but because human survival has always run on cooperation. Our ancestors seem to have understood something we still rely on today. A child isn't just one more mouth to feed. A child is the future of the group. And protecting that future may be one of the oldest reasons our species is still here to tell the story. It's easy to picture the Stone Age as nothing but cold, hunger, and danger, and a lot of that is true. But underneath it, there's another story. One about people showing up for each other when it mattered most. Long before history was written down, we'd already learned one of the most important lessons our species would ever need. We survived together. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you in the next amazing video. Don't forget to subscribe.